What will the climate change strategy be if the Liberals win the next election?
I think the Liberal plan would have to be a complete look at all sources of greenhouse gas emissions in this country and an industrial strategy which will deal with those emissions. That is, it's almost like mobilizing as we did in 1939 for World War II. We need a countrywide mobilization. We need to bring all levels of government together, including the provinces and municipalities. We've got to bring in industry, and we've got to look at every single source of emissions so that we can work in reducing them. If we do that, then we've got not only a climate change plan, we've got an industrial strategy for the 21st century, because we'll be embracing the new industrial revolution.
Do you seriously think the Kyoto Protocol can be revived?
The Kyoto Protocol is part of a United Nations process. That process will continue to be developed this December in Bali, where the annual meeting of the United Nations on climate change will take place. Kyoto was a step along the way. There'll be a post-2012 period after Kyoto expires. Kyoto got us going in developing international mechanisms. It is not the end of the road. It's just a step along the way. So the United Nations process will continue, and Canada's got to play an essential leadership role there. But it won't be Kyoto after 2012. It'll be something else.
Do you believe the Liberals should bring down the government in the next few months?
The test of when the Liberals should decide to bring down the government depends very much on a couple of things. We have to find the moment when Canadians are saying to us, bring these guys down and we'll vote for you. We need to see signs in the polls that we've got momentum. And we also need to find the right issue to trigger an election on, one which is clearly something that is upsetting Canadians enough that they will ask us to form a government. There's no point in bringing down this government unless we're going to become the next government. It's not, we don't just bring them down to bring them down. We bring them down so that we can win and do what Canadians want us to do.
Do you agree with the current Liberal strategy of abstaining on votes to prevent an election?
Absolutely. I think the trick is to find the right moment. Only the Liberal Party has the votes to bring down this government. The government cannot bring itself down under the current law. We should choose a moment where it works for us and for Canadians, when we've got a chance of beating these guys on an issue which is really important to people. So we're not in that zone yet, and the trick is to be patient and to harass them in the House of Commons. That's our job. We're the opposition. To find ways of improving legislation, but to be patient enough to pick the right moment so that we can win.
You mentioned harass. How exactly what's your strategy there on harassment to the Conservative government?
Well, there's some really great cases in point in the last few days of Parliament before we had the break. Clearly, we want to know more about their in-and-out election financing scheme, which has been denounced by Elections Canada, and they're in court on that. I think we want to ask some questions about Mr. Mulroney and the fact that he was paid a large sum of money when it seems that he may have misrepresented the true situation. We are going to criticize them on legislation which they're going to bring forward. So our job is to do what an opposition does, which is to criticize them, at the same time trying to improve legislation, which is what we've always done. That's the role of a responsible opposition.
As far as the Kyoto Protocol is concerned, the Conservative did not pass the legislation that they were supposed to, and there's a lawsuit still pending. Can you bring me up to date on that?
Well, there are a couple of things. One is that a bill passed, which was a private member's bill, a Liberal bill, called 288, which says the government must give an account of how they're doing in meeting our Kyoto obligations as a country. So there are some environmentalists who think that the government has not given that accounting which they're obliged to do by law. So that's one question. I guess another question is what the government will be doing in the future to show that Canada is still part of the international climate change system. So those are two really important questions.
With all the legalities, the lawsuits and scandals that are basically dogging the Conservatives, I mean, have you seen this kind of political climate before? I mean, what gives with this government?
Well, I think that the problem with the government is that it's so tightly controlled by one man, the Prime Minister, that it is not possible to keep a handle on everything, and that the ministers, because they're not being asked to use their own authority and judgment, are behind in their decision making. So things get repressed, and then when they pop out, they sometimes go wrong. I mean, for example, there was a case where there were cuts to the Canadian Wildlife Service. It was only $1.5 million, and yet it had huge ramifications for protecting wildlife in this country. The minister didn't think about it, and it went out of control. And I think that's going to happen more and more, where we're going to discover that in this centralized form of government, you can't keep a control on everything.
Do you think they're headed for a bit of a meltdown in the future?
Well, I think that it's impossible to predict what's going to happen in politics. We know that events come along and change things. We know that Mr. Harper, if you give him enough rope, will wind himself in it very nicely. That came out during the course of the last week, when we saw him yank the nominations of perfectly honourable Conservative candidates in Ontario for no good reason, being a complete control freak about it. Same with Bill Casey's nomination in New Brunswick, and in Nova Scotia, and that his angry retort when we asked the reasonable question, don't you think, in the light of this new information about the money that went to Mr. Mulrooney, we ought to have a bit of an inquiry? He lashed out and made all sorts of unfounded allegations about people like Paul Martin, which are completely uncalled for. So we see that when he's under pressure, the Prime Minister reveals his true colours, and that's why we need to keep him in the House of Commons revealing his true colours.
Thank you very much for your time.